This week's story is called Sin Nombre. On Thursday morning, April 29th, 1993, the sun rose over the high desert of Little Water, New Mexico. The air was crisp and the sky was pink as 21-year-old Florina Woody went for a run with her 19-year-old boyfriend, Merrill Bay. Florina and Merrill were both Navajo and lived in a small rural town on the vast Navajo reservation that sprawls across 3 southwestern states. Florina loved the majestic landscape surrounding the town and spent as much time as she could outdoors. And she was especially happy to be outside again after a long, wet winter. She and Merrill jogged along the country highway past small houses and trailer homes set back from the road. In the distance, Florina admired the tall red rock cliffs glowing in the sun. The couple turned off the road and headed up a path toward a flat-topped hill called a mesa. Usually, the top was dry and dusty, but the wet winter had turned it lush and green and scattered with wildflowers. Once they reached the top, they stopped to look down at the town below. Florina could just make out the trailer home that she and Merrill shared with her parents. It sometimes felt crowded living there together, but she was grateful for their close-knit family, especially since she and Merrill were raising their first child now, a 6-month-old son. Florina and Merrill jogged back down the mesa and kept a steady pace the whole way home. Merrill had recently started competing in local races and was always trying to strengthen his endurance. As for Florina, she had reasons to challenge herself too. She'd originally taken up running to offset her asthma, which had gotten better lately. Once they got home, Florina went inside their trailer, she showered, and then she went to relax on the couch. But when she sat down, she noticed her neck and back muscles were aching more than usual. She asked Merrill for a massage, but her muscles still felt sore afterwards. Florina wondered if she might have pulled something during their run, so she tried to take it easy for the rest of the day. Over the weekend and into the following week, Florina's aches and pains did not get better. She developed a cough, too, that felt different than her usual asthma. By Friday, just over a week after she first felt sick, Florina realized her symptoms were not going away with rest, so Merrill made her a doctor's appointment for the next day. On Saturday, May 8th, while Merrill watched the baby, Florina's parents drove her to Crown Point Healthcare Facility, which was located about an hour and a half south and east of their town. It was a commute Florina knew well, since she'd given birth there. Crown Point was a small rural hospital operated by the Indian Health Service with about 10 doctors. 2 of the doctors were a married couple named Christine Golnick and Thomas Hennessy, who had helped deliver Florina's baby. Florina's parents parked close to the entrance and walked with her into the lobby. Right away, Florina saw Dr. Golnick's familiar face smiling at her. Florina smiled back and waved. After signing in, she followed Dr. Golnick to an exam room in the back. Dr. Golnick placed a stethoscope on Florina's chest and listened. Then she held her fingers to Florina's wrist and measured her pulse. Florina watched Dr. Golnick's face for a reaction, but her expression remained neutral. The doctor understood why Florina was worried, since her symptoms had persisted for so long, but thankfully her vitals had come back normal, and so the doctor suspected it was just a bad case of the flu. But considering Florina's history with asthma and her lingering symptoms, Dr. Golnick didn't want to take any chances. She suggested that Florina spend the night at the hospital. In the morning, Dr. Golnick's husband, Dr. Hennessy, could come give a second opinion. Florina resisted at first, since the next day was Mother's Day. She said she wanted to get home and spend it with Merrill and their baby, but Dr. Golnick promised Florina that she could leave once Dr. Hennessy checked up on her the next day. So Florina agreed to stay. She knew that it was better to play it safe, especially because she lived so far from the hospital. She told her parents they could head home for the night, and then she called Merrill. He told her he loved her and promised he'd come get her first thing in the morning once she was discharged. The next morning, Florina woke to a knock at the door. It was Dr. Hennessy, and Florina was glad to see him, because now she was feeling worse and she was struggling to catch her breath. Dr. Hennessy listened to her lungs with a stethoscope and frowned. He told Florina that he wanted to take a chest x-ray to get a better look at her lungs. Unfortunately, that meant Florina would have to stay at the hospital a bit longer. Florina was disappointed, but she was also relieved that Dr. Hennessy seemed to be treating her symptoms so seriously. Whatever was going on with her felt much worse than the usual breathing issues she experienced from her asthma, and she was starting to get scared. A few minutes later, a technician wheeled in a mobile x-ray unit and scanned Florina's upper body. While she waited for the results, a nurse brought Florina a phone so she could call Merrill. And when Merrill answered, he told Florina that their baby was napping and they'd just celebrate Mother's Day when she got home that night. Hearing Merrill's voice calmed her down, but Florina still felt helpless and lonely. This was not how she envisioned her first Mother's Day going. A little over an hour later, the X-ray technician brought Florina's test results to Dr. Hennessy. The image showed Florina's lungs all whited out, which meant they were full of fluid. Dr. Hennessy was shocked by what he saw, and he ran to Florina's room. He found her lying there with her eyes half closed and her mouth ringed with a dry white liquid. She was desperately struggling to breathe. Dr. Hennessy couldn't believe it. For a patient this young and athletic to go from healthy to near respiratory failure in 24 hours was unheard of. The doctor immediately called for a helicopter to fly Florina to the University of New Mexico Hospital in Albuquerque, which had a much better equipped intensive care unit. But until the helicopter arrived, Dr. Hennessy had to try everything possible to stabilize her condition. He fitted Florina with an oxygen mask to pump air into her lungs, but within a few moments, she coughed up bloody pink froth. Dr. Hennessy's face turned ashen as he realized what was happening. Florina's lungs were so congested, the extra oxygen was not doing anything. And there was another urgent problem. Florina's blood pressure was dropping rapidly. Dr. Hennessy shouted for a nurse to give Florina IV fluids, and as the medicine entered Florina's body, Dr. Hennessy's eyes shot over to the monitors tracking her vitals. They were still extremely weak. Florina's body just wasn't getting enough oxygen, and her organs were starting to shut down. Getting Florina to breathe was now a matter of life and death. The doctor quickly snapped on a pair of fresh gloves, he grabbed a scalpel from an operating tray, and then took a deep breath to steady himself. And then, when Dr. Hennessy was ready, he carefully cut an incision into Florina's throat and inserted a breathing tube directly into Florina's airway. He heard Florina's heart rate monitor beep rapidly for a few moments, and then it went flat. Florina had gone into cardiac arrest. Dr. Hennessy knew he only had a few seconds left to save her life. He started CPR while the nurse grabbed the defibrillator. Once it was charged, the doctor grabbed the paddles and pressed them to Florina's chest, and then the machine released a bolt of electricity into her body. Florina's heart rate monitor stayed flat, so Dr. Hennessy recharged the defibrillator and sent another shock through Florina's body. Just then, a nurse ran in and told the doctor that the helicopter had just arrived. But by this point, Dr. Hennessy just shook his head. It was too late. Florina was dead. Later that morning, Florina's fiancé, Merrill, was at home sitting by the baby's crib when his phone rang. He recognized the voice on the other end as one of the doctors from Crown Point Hospital, but the words he was hearing, he just couldn't compute. Something had gone terribly wrong, Florina had died, and no one really knew why. Doctors were running tests, but they had never seen anything like it before. Merrill crumpled to the floor. When he'd kissed Florina goodbye less than 24 hours ago, she'd been a bit under the weather, but it didn't seem serious. He didn't understand how this could have happened. Merrill took a moment to gather himself, then he walked into the kitchen where Florina's parents were having their morning coffee. He tried to tell them what had happened, but the words got stuck in his throat. Then he just closed his eyes, let out a deep breath, and blurted out, "Florina is dead." Florina's parents stared at him blankly. Her mother asked him what he was talking about. Tears started streaming out of Merrill's eyes as he explained what the doctors had just told him. Florina really was dead. It had happened extremely fast, and the doctors couldn't do anything to save her. This time it sunk in, and Florina's parents started sobbing. How could a 21-year-old mother in perfect health just suddenly die? That night, Merrill barely slept, and the next day he woke up in a fog. Food tasted like nothing. He fed and changed the baby, but it felt mechanical. Everything reminded him of Florina. On Tuesday, May 11th, so 2 days after Florina died, Merrill woke up feeling weak and sluggish. He felt like it was something more than the physical effects of his grief, and he was concerned after what had happened to his wife. The doctors still didn't know what killed Florina, and Merrill didn't want to take any chances. However, he had a lot of planning to do for Florina's funeral, and he didn't want to drive all the way to the Crown Point Hospital, so he decided to go to the local health clinic instead. Merrill told the doctor there what had happened to Florina and that he was now feeling sick. The doctor agreed that Merrill was right to be cautious, but he said Merrill's situation was different than his wife's. Florina had asthma, and that likely contributed to her very rapid decline. The doctor told Merrill to rest and sent him home with a prescription-strength pain reliever, an antibiotic, and an antiviral medication. Merrill took these medications over the next few days, but none of them seemed to work. He felt more exhausted each day, and even worse on Friday, May 14th, which was the day of Florina's funeral. Florina's cousin picked Merrill up at the family's trailer that morning, and then they set off for the 70-mile drive south to Sunset Memorial Park in Gallup, New Mexico, where Florina was going to be buried. But they hadn't been in the car long before Merrill started gasping for air. Now, this was before people carried cell phones, so Merrill's cousin had to pull off the highway at a general store to call 911 on a landline. And while he did that, Merrill stumbled out of the car and lurched around in the parking lot, panicking, while his lips and fingernails started turning blue, and then he just collapsed. Paramedics got to the location quickly and raced Merrill to the Gallup Indian Medical Center, and once they arrived, nurses wheeled his stretcher into the emergency room. But by the time he was inside, Merrill had stopped breathing. The physician on duty, Dr. Bruce Tempest, tried to revive him, but it was no use. He declared Merrill dead upon arrival. Later that day, Dr. Tempest sat slumped in a chair, feeling defeated. He had worked at Gallup Indian Medical Center for 23 years and was widely considered an expert at internal medicine. He'd even been awarded the Indian Health Service Clinician of the Year in 1983. But he had felt powerless, being unable to save Merrill's life. As Dr. Tempest signed and dated Merrill's time of death paperwork, an assistant mentioned that the man's fiancée had died too just a week earlier, and like Merrill, she had been in good shape and just declined really quickly. Dr. Tempest felt a wave of fear rise in his chest. Two young, physically fit people didn't just suddenly die of respiratory failure, one right after another. Something had to make them sick. As he thought about Merrill's death, Dr. Tempest realized he'd seen other cases like it. In the past 6 months, he had treated 3 other young Navajos with fatal respiratory issues. He couldn't help wondering if maybe these deaths were all connected. Whatever had killed Florina and Merrill might have killed the others too. The fact that all of the dead were Navajos living within the same general area led the doctor to suspect that this disease might be contagious, and if he had to guess, it seemed like it spread through the air, since the lungs were the most affected organ in every case. If he was right, this could be the start of an incredibly dangerous outbreak. But before he jumped to any conclusions, he needed to gather more information. Dr. Tempest called Crown Point Medical Center, where Florina had been treated before she died. He explained he had treated her boyfriend and wanted to learn what happened to Florina. The doctors at Crown Point didn't hesitate to share a detailed breakdown of her illness. Afterwards, Dr. Tempest hung up and compared both cases. Florina's sounded exactly like what happened to Merrill. It just didn't make sense to Dr. Tempest. He'd never heard of any disease that behaved like this. Also, during this call, the doctor had learned something else that totally puzzled him. Merrill and Florina's 6-month-old son had not gotten sick at all. If this was a contagious airborne disease, the baby would have probably caught it from one of his parents. And why hadn't the grandparents gotten sick either? There was one more thing that was bothering Dr. Tempest. So far, there hadn't been any mild cases of this disease reported. Every single person who got sick died. This disease was unlike anything he had seen before. If it kept spreading, many more people could die. That weekend, Dr. Tempest compiled all the information he could on Florina and Merrill's cases. Then, 3 days after he pronounced Merrill dead, Dr. Tempest phoned the state health department and told them they had a problem. 11 days later, Dr. Jeffrey Dutchin was wrapping up his work at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, where he investigated dangerous outbreaks of disease. He was still in training at the CDC, and the work was demanding. Now he was looking forward to spending the long Memorial Day weekend with his family. But as he was getting ready to leave, there was a knock on his door. It was Dr. Dutchin's boss, and he had a critical job for him. Something troubling was happening on the Navajo reservation. Young, healthy people were dying, and no one knew why. 6 people had already died from this mystery illness, and 4 others had been hospitalized. The CDC was sending out a team early tomorrow morning, and his boss wanted Dr. Dutchin to be a part of it. Dr. Dutchin immediately switched gears and started putting documents in his briefcase. It didn't matter that he had plans with his family. This was urgent. That night, Dr. Dutchin met with the team that was being sent to the Navajo reservation to go over their plan. Once the meeting ended, he was handed a doctor's bag and opened it up to look at the equipment. Along with the regular tools of his trade, he was surprised to find something completely unexpected: a gas mask. Dr. Dutchin knew that it was too early to know what they were up against, but the signs were not good. The next day, Dr. Dutchin and 2 other colleagues from the CDC landed in New Mexico and went straight to an emergency conference of over 30 public health officials. Huge whiteboards lined every wall of the conference room, scribbled with the names of possible germs and toxins, everything from herpes to heavy metals to pesticides and plagues. The mood was frantic. Dr. Dutchin was overwhelmed by all the theories and potential diseases being proposed. Each theory was discussed and dissected. The more possibilities they ruled out, the more worried Dutchin felt. It meant that the cause of death was either something so rare there were very few experts on it, or it was something entirely new. And the longer researchers took to find answers, the more people could die. In fact, on the same day the conference started, a seemingly healthy teenage Navajo girl had collapsed at a school dance at a state park. She died a few hours later. Her death was a stark reminder that the clock was ticking. There was only so much the gathered scientists could accomplish by looking at whiteboards in a conference room. They needed more data. Dr. Dutchin and his colleagues decided to survey some local residents and gather blood samples from anyone who was willing to participate. 2 days after the CDC team arrived, the president of the Navajo Nation, Peterson Za, looked out the window of his office in Window Rock, Arizona. The whole Four Corners area, where Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado meet, and where the Navajo live, had turned into a media circus. News vans were crammed into every available space of the parking lot below. Za's phone was ringing non-stop with calls from journalists, health officials, and locals asking for information on this mystery disease. Za had nothing to tell any of them, but he hoped that would change soon. The Navajo leader was not participating in the CDC's big conference, although he was keeping tabs on their progress. He'd barely slept over the weekend because he was anxiously waiting for any updates. But from what he'd seen so far, he thought the CDC's investigation and the media attention it brought had not been much help. Za's people were terrified, and the outsiders' ignorance of Navajo customs was adding to their panic. Newspapers were printing the names of the deceased right away, even though Navajo tradition forbade their names from being spoken or written for 4 days after they died. This was causing a lot of pain and confusion for the Navajo people. They believed this would prevent the spirit of the dead from properly transitioning to the afterlife. And aggravating the already sensitive situation, some scientists were going right up to people's homes and knocking on the door. They had no idea that Navajo custom required them to wait 30 feet away until they were invited inside. These cultural misunderstandings had led to escalating tension on the reservation, and Za was worried about what might happen next. Just then, the phone rang again. It was a Navajo woman from the reservation claiming that some medical researchers were bothering her family. Za assured her he would be right there to handle the situation. Za hung up, then headed outside. He made his way through the crowd of reporters waiting outside his office. As they shouted questions at him, he promised he'd share any new information with them as soon as he had it. Then he got in his truck and headed to the address the woman on the phone had given him. A few minutes later, Za pulled up to a cluster of low Pueblo buildings that marked the address. The sun was high, barely casting shadows across the dusty ground. Za saw a small crowd shouting at two men who were standing off to the side. Both the men looked rattled and confused. Za assumed they were the scientists that the woman had called him about. The situation looked heated, and he sensed it was about to get out of control. Za got out of his truck and recognized the woman who'd called him, and when she saw him, she ran over to him and explained what was going on. The two scientists had knocked on her door, asking if her family would be willing to donate blood for testing. Za shook his head in disgust. Now he understood why the crowd was so upset. He wove his way through them and walked up to the two scientists. Everyone grew silent as Za introduced himself and explained that the researchers had deeply violated Navajo custom. The scientists' unannounced arrival at the woman's house was considered trespassing by the Navajo people, but even more offensive was their request for a blood sample. The Navajo believe that blood is spiritually attached to the body, and giving a blood sample is seen as a grave violation of privacy. The scientists' ignorance of this cultural belief was an insult to this woman. The scientists' faces turned red, and they apologized profusely. They said they were there on official business researching the outbreak and did not mean to offend anyone. Za cautioned them to be more careful. He wanted to stop this outbreak as much as they did, but if the scientists could not get people to trust them, then they certainly would never learn what caused this disease. The scientists apologized again and packed up to leave. Za calmed the crowd and told the woman to call if any other strange people came around. He had a feeling that there was more trouble to come. Back at his office that same day, Za read the latest news on the outbreak with growing discouragement. The Navajo people weren't just facing problems on the reservation. People in the wider area were beginning to shun them out of fear of the disease. There were several articles about Navajo families being banned from local restaurants and businesses. There was even a report about 27 Navajo third graders from Chinle, Arizona, being denied a field trip to visit pen pals at another school in California. And worse, people were still dying. The death toll was now up to 10, and many more were very sick. Za's eyes locked on one particular article about the outbreak in the Washington Post. A particular phrase in the opening paragraph immediately jumped out at him. It said, quote, "The Navajo flu." He slammed the newspaper down on his desk and rubbed his temples. This had gone far enough. He called in his assistant and told her to schedule a leadership council meeting immediately. The next day, Dr. Ben Muneta, an Indian Health Services doctor in New Mexico, received a call from Za's assistant inviting him to a meeting that night in Window Rock, Arizona, about the outbreak. Dr. Muneta understood why he was being asked to go. His grandfather had been a famous medicine man in the tribe. He had inspired Dr. Muneta to become a Stanford-trained physician with a unique knowledge of both modern science and traditional Navajo medicine. Dr. Muneta had been at the CDC's conference and could be a bridge between their investigation and the Navajo people. He told the assistant he'd be there. As he drove to Window Rock, Dr. Muneta passed a sign nailed to a telephone pole that said, quote, "No media allowed, no newspaper, TV, radio, etc. This means you," end quote. He could tell the locals were clearly fed up with the negative attention. His thoughts turned to his colleague at the CDC, Jeffrey Dutchin. Dr. Dutchin and the other scientists were doing their best to solve this mystery, but they needed help from the Navajo. He hoped that this meeting he was going to have with President Za was the start of that. A few minutes later, Dr. Muneta arrived at Za's office and was led to a small conference room. Dr. Muneta realized this wouldn't be anything like the CDC's giant conference. It was an intentionally small meeting that left out the federal researchers altogether. Za didn't want them interfering in Navajo business. Aside from Za, there were a few senior Navajo medicine men in attendance. The only other physician in the room was the state's deputy commissioner of health. Once everyone was seated, President Za asked Dr. Muneta to update them on how the investigation was going so far. Dr. Muneta admitted that the CDC hadn't found much yet, but they were testing freely given blood samples for all kinds of diseases and working through all the possibilities. Dr. Muneta then turned to the medicine men and asked them for their prayers. The eldest medicine man was grateful for Dr. Muneta's request, but instead of prayers, he offered his own interpretation of the mystery disease outbreak. He believed that too many young Navajo were abandoning traditional practices such as speaking the language and living off the land. They were neglecting ceremonies that were meant to heal the sick, bring good fortune, and celebrate life's milestones. One of the most important of these is called the Blessing Way, which is performed for newborns, brides and grooms, and people who are sick or who have experienced a traumatic event. Without these traditions to keep the world in balance, death was sure to follow. Dr. Moneta could sense the medicine man was holding something back. However, it would be improper for him to press his elder for more information. According to Navajo custom, if Dr. Moneta wanted more knowledge, he had to partake in a ceremony that lasted for several days. As much as Dr. Moneta wanted to adhere to tradition, he knew there was no time to waste. He gathered himself, then sat up straight and looked at the eldest medicine man. In a quiet but very firm voice, Dr. Moneta asked if the medicine man could just tell him more. For a long moment, the medicine man just stared at him. Dr. Moneta felt a knot growing in the pit of his stomach. He knew how upset the Navajos already were that the investigators were violating their customs, and now Dr. Moneta, who knew better, had done it as well. Finally, the medicine man spoke. He acknowledged that Dr. Moneta's behavior was irregular, but considering the gravity of the situation, he agreed to say more, and immediately Dr. Moneta let out a sigh of relief. According to the elder, this was not the first time a deadly illness like this had struck the Navajo. There had been 2 other bouts of mysterious respiratory failure deaths in their community. One was in 1918, and the other was in 1933. It was a long time ago, but stories were still told among the Navajo about those who had died. Dr. Moneta asked if there had been anything similar about the years in question. The medicine man nodded. Both had been unseasonably wet winters with lots of rain, just like this recent one. Then he described how water changed the land, and these changes in turn brought a creature that carried death. Dr. Moneta knew what the medicine man was referring to. The creature was a real animal that was a prominent figure in Navajo mythology. Navajo called it Na'atsunse and believed it was equally capable of spreading life or death. In Navajo legend, if Na'atsunse entered a home and saw people being wasteful, it would then choose the Navajo's strongest young people to die. Moneta thought about what the medicine man revealed. The doctor didn't think that this animal was literally passing judgment on the Navajo and killing them, and in real life, he'd never heard of it spreading a disease like this through contact with humans. But as he considered the possibility, he came up with a theory that explained how it could happen. And if he was right, it would completely explain this deadly outbreak. Dr. Moneta raced back home and called his CDC colleague, Jeffrey Dutchin, who had led the emergency conference the week before. Dutchin was relieved to hear that the disease was not completely new, but he was confused when Dr. Moneta explained that the outbreak was related to the rain. This land had experienced every type of weather over time. Rain was not unusual, but this disease was. Dr. Moneta told him that it wasn't the rain itself. It was the animal from Navajo legends that came as a result of the rain. And if they were going to solve this mystery, then they would need to find as many of these creatures as possible. Dr. Moneta could sense Dr. Dutchin hesitate, but so far nothing else had worked, and as strange as this theory was about mythical creatures, it was the most promising lead they had. And so Dr. Dutchin told Dr. Moneta he'd get a team together right away. And this time, he'd make sure the investigators respected the Navajo's cultural practices. 3 days later, Dr. Dutchin walked out of his hotel a few miles south of the Navajo reservation. He'd organized this investigation with the help of President Za, and it would be conducted with the help and guidance of medicine men and other Navajo representatives. Dr. Dutchin scanned the parking lot and spotted 4 men gathered around a couple of beat-up trucks. Dr. Dutchin smiled and headed over to them. They were the CDC experts sent to trap the animals that Dr. Moneta had told him about. Another car pulled up next to them, and a stocky Navajo man climbed out. He was an environmental health expert sent by President Za to help with the investigation. He clapped Dr. Dutchin on the back and promised he'd help them find what they were looking for. Dr. Dutchin felt a surge of hope. Thanks to the Navajos, he believed they knew what was making people sick. Now they'd be able to track down that creature that was spreading disease around the area, and hopefully they could figure out how to treat the illness before it killed anyone else. They all piled into a truck and headed for the Navajo reservation. The next day, Dr. Dutchin stood in the middle of the desert. He was dressed in full biohazard gear, a silver suit, airtight helmet, and heavy boots and gloves. He looked across the desert landscape at the other members of his team. They were all dressed in the same protective gear. To outside observers, they might have all looked like astronauts from a movie set. But the work they were doing was very real, and if they weren't careful, it could be very dangerous. Dr. Dutchin was standing above a trap he'd set the day before. Before he checked it, he made sure the wind was blowing away from him to avoid inhaling any harmful particles. If he caught an infected animal, he could be at serious risk for picking up this disease. Once Dr. Dutchin was certain that he was safe, he cautiously bent down and examined the trap. Through the thick material of his helmet, he could hear a faint sound coming from inside, the sounds of a trapped animal. He looked over to his colleagues, who were also examining their traps. Dr. Dutchin hoped that at least one of them had caught what they were looking for. Over the next few days, Dr. Dutchin and his team caught all sorts of animals. They carefully took samples and sent them off to the CDC in Atlanta for analysis. On June 16th, 4 days after the specimens arrived in Atlanta, Dr. Dutchin got his confirmation. The disease afflicting the Navajo wasn't entirely new. It was called a hantavirus. But this strain of hantavirus was entirely unique. The CDC had not been able to identify it earlier because it typically attacks the kidneys, while this particular strain affected people's lungs. But thanks to the tip from the Navajo's medicine men, the CDC scientists knew what was spreading the disease. It was the creature known as the Naatsunse. When Dr. Mineta met with President Za and the medicine men, they told him how this real-life animal played a prominent role in the Navajo's origin myth. According to Navajo legend, the creature is responsible for spreading the seeds of life across the world. However, it can also be dangerous, and its breath can be fatal. This animal is incredibly common in North America, but the Navajo fear it so intensely they burn their clothes if it even touches them. Individually, this animal is not a huge threat, because each one doesn't carry enough of the hantavirus to endanger anyone. But if there's enough of them, they can spread disease like wildfire. In that winter, the heavy rains in the Four Corners area created a concentrated population of the animal that had only occurred twice before, in 1918 and in 1933. In all three instances, the heavy rains had led to more plants and vegetation. This in turn fed the creature and allowed them to multiply. The creature then infiltrated the homes of Navajo people like Florina Woody and Merrill Bay, leaving traces of the hantavirus everywhere they went. The creature that was responsible for spreading this disease was the humble deer mouse. And a hantavirus is a family of viruses spread mainly by rodents. And that spring, deer mice had been all over the Navajo reservation and surrounding area. They crept into homes, they nested in sheds, barns, and storage units. No matter how many holes were plugged or traps were laid, there were just too many of them to stop. And wherever they went, they left their droppings, which carried the deadly virus. When people like Florina and Merrill tried to clean those areas, they came into direct contact with the droppings, and the virus entered their bodies in high enough concentrations to infect them. But now that the CDC knew what was behind the outbreak, local officials could reduce the danger. After the deer mouse was identified as the culprit, public health advisories urged people to avoid rodents and told them how to make it harder for them to enter their homes. And while that didn't eliminate the danger entirely, it reduced it enough to help the outbreak end by the middle of August, almost 3 months after Florina Woody died. All told, 24 people in the Four Corners area were infected with this previously unknown virus. Tragically, half of them died. But thanks to the cooperation between the CDC and the Navajo people, the damage was limited, and there have been very few outbreaks since then. In keeping with the Navajo custom of not speaking the names of the dead, the CDC decided to call this North American hantavirus strain Sin Nombre, which means without a name. On the morning of August 23, 1993, Crystal Perry got ready for work in the bedroom of her small white wooden house in Bridgeton, Maine. And she was excited because it was her 30th birthday. Crystal was very attractive with pale freckled skin, light blue eyes, and thick, bright red hair. Her hair actually was so bright that it made her almost immediately recognizable wherever she went in her small town. And on the rare occasions when Crystal went out to a bar or went dancing with her friends, her looks made her the center of attention. Or they made her an object of desire for men watching her from a distance who couldn't get the nerve up to go talk to her. In her bedroom, Crystal finished getting dressed for work, and then she called out to her 11-year-old daughter, Sarah, to let her know it was time to go. But Sarah was already standing behind her mom, and she shouted, "Happy birthday!" Crystal was startled, but she turned around and gave Sarah a big hug. Crystal had only been 18 years old when Sarah was born, and she had actually only been 15 years old when she married Sarah's father. At such a young age, Crystal's parents had to give their legal permission for the marriage to take place. But the marriage didn't last, and Crystal had gotten divorced when Sarah was a little girl. Since then, Crystal and Sarah had pretty much been on their own, and they were as close as a mother and daughter could get. They spent almost every night together, watching movies, reading books, and talking and laughing in their house. Even as Sarah got older, Crystal still made it a point to tuck her in before bed, and sometimes she would even sing to her until she fell asleep. And on that morning of her 30th birthday, Crystal was heading out to her job at a local shoe factory that she had only taken just so she could make enough money to afford the little house where she and her daughter lived. The work Crystal did, sewing parts of shoes by hand, was totally backbreaking, and she would come home from work at night feeling totally tired and smelling of chemicals from the factory. But Crystal thought the long hours and hard work was all worth it because Sarah had a home and a room of her own. Crystal and Sarah walked outside, they got into Crystal's car in the driveway, and drove down the road through Brighton. Their house was secluded and surrounded by woods, and there were only a few houses nearby. But after a short drive, they pulled up to the house of a family friend where Sarah was going to spend the day. Crystal gave her daughter a kiss, told her she loved her, and then waved goodbye as Sarah walked up to the house. Then Crystal drove off and headed to work. When Crystal was a few minutes away from the shoe factory, she slowed down and stared out the windshield. There were these black balloons tied to a telephone pole. It was a weird sight, and Crystal didn't know what the balloons were for. And then things got even weirder when she saw more black balloons tied to telephone poles at regular intervals along the road. Then, when she was just outside of work, she saw even more black balloons, but this time they were attached to a huge sign that said, "Happy 30th, Crystal." Crystal nearly slammed on her brakes, and she almost started crying out of happiness. She couldn't believe her friends and coworkers had taken the time to set all this up just to make her feel special on her birthday. Then she started laughing when she realized they'd chosen black balloons because she was 30 years old now. Crystal parked her car and walked into work, and there were even more balloons and signs waiting for her. And that day, they had a huge party for her at the factory, but that was just the beginning of Crystal's birthday celebration. That night at the house, Crystal made dinner, and Sarah set the table. Crystal's boyfriend, Dennis Butler, was on his way over to join them for Crystal's birthday dinner, and Sarah was very excited. She liked Dennis because he was funny and nice to her, and he didn't talk to her like she was a little kid. Crystal was happy that Dennis was good with Sarah and that Sarah liked him, but Crystal still wasn't sure about her own relationship with Dennis. Dennis was about to turn 20 years old, but he worked full-time and he'd actually already been married before, so he seemed older than he was. But Crystal still just felt totally strange about the 10-year age gap between them. Still, Crystal and Dennis always had a good time together, and she knew finding the right guy in a small town wasn't always easy. The tourists who came to Bridgeton, Maine from all across New England saw it as a quaint little city with stunning natural beauty and charming shops and restaurants. But the people who lived there knew there was actually a side of the town that the tourists did not see. Drug use and drug dealing had been a problem in the area for years. In fact, one of Dennis's old high school classmates who lived not too far from Crystal, a guy named Michael Hutchinson, was known to show up to bars in town or just to walk around the streets totally high on cocaine. So, as Crystal put the finishing touches on dinner, she told herself that at least Dennis had not fallen into that kind of lifestyle. And it was her birthday, so she just wanted to be happy and have a good time and not spend the night worrying about her future with Dennis. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the front door, and so Sarah walked across the linoleum kitchen floor, went through the small living room, and opened the door, and there was Dennis. Dennis said hello to Sarah and gave her a big hug, and then he shouted happy birthday to Crystal. Dennis was tall and thin with dark hair and a square jaw, and he wore a gold earring in one of his ears. He went into the kitchen, gave Crystal a kiss, and then handed her a birthday card and a present. And a few minutes later, Crystal, Sarah, and Dennis sat down at the kitchen table and had dinner, and then they ate the birthday cake. After dinner and cake, Sarah helped her mom clear the dishes and put them in the sink. Then she handed her mom a small box with a bow on it. Crystal opened the present, and right away she got choked up. Sarah had gotten her this little pewter figurine of a warrior woman holding a sword, a perfect symbol of a single mother who fought as hard as she could to take care of her daughter. The three of them went into the living room and talked for a while. Then at some point, Sarah felt tired, so she got up, said goodnight to her mom and Dennis, and headed up to her bedroom. Crystal didn't tuck Sarah in that night because she stayed on the couch talking to Dennis. And so Sarah lay in bed thinking that Dennis and her mom might get married soon, and the thought of that made her happy. But as Sarah began to drift off to sleep, she began hearing yelling from the living room. And not long after that, Sarah heard the front door slam shut. And then she heard Dennis's car screeching out of the driveway. Sarah had no idea what had happened, but it obviously sounded bad, but she just stayed there in bed and tried to go to sleep. Crystal sat in the living room, crying on the couch. Her perfect birthday had fallen apart because Dennis had flown off the handle and gotten totally upset with her. She didn't actually know why he'd gotten upset. Maybe it was because she mentioned that she was not sure about their future, or maybe it was something Crystal wasn't even aware of. But the reason for the outburst didn't really matter to Crystal, because when Dennis had gotten angry, he got loud and scary. And she decided that was not the kind of guy she wanted around her daughter anymore. And so, before Dennis had stormed out of the house, Crystal had made it clear to him that their relationship was over. Crystal wiped the tears from her eyes, went to her room, and got ready for bed. Then she climbed under the covers and stared up at the ceiling. She knew the black balloons her friends and coworkers had gotten her for her birthday had been a joke, but for the first time, Crystal really did feel old. However, she hoped, now that she was 30, that her life would get a little calmer and easier, and that she wouldn't have any more nights that ended in shouting matches. But not long after Crystal's 30th birthday, for reasons even Crystal couldn't totally figure out, Crystal let Dennis right back into her life. Dennis spent the next several months trying to convince Crystal to put their past arguments behind them. He worked hard to prove that she could trust him, and he did everything he could to win her back. And Sarah found herself hoping that her mom and Dennis would make things work and stay together for good this time. And eventually, Dennis proposed to Crystal, and Crystal said yes. And for a time after the proposal, Crystal and Sarah thought their lives were about to change for good. And, along with Dennis, they would become this happy, loving family. On the night of May 11th, 1994, so 9 months after Crystal's 30th birthday, Crystal sat at the foot of Sarah's bed. Sarah was 12 years old now, but she still liked talking to her mom every night before she went to sleep. And for the past few weeks, Sarah had felt like she was comforting Crystal more than Crystal was comforting her when they talked at night. Because even though Crystal and Dennis were still engaged, their relationship had taken a bad turn again. They had started getting on each other's nerves again, and there were lots of nights that Sarah fell asleep listening to the sound of them screaming at each other in the living room. And there were other nights when Dennis was not at the house that the phone would ring, Crystal would answer, and she would hear screaming on the other line, and so she would just hang up. Sarah knew her mom was worried about the arguments and the angry phone calls, but whenever the mother and daughter were together, Crystal never let on that she was upset. She was always very positive and upbeat around her daughter. Crystal thought that no matter what happened with her and Dennis, that she and Sarah would be just fine. In the bedroom, Crystal said goodnight to Sarah, kissed her on the forehead, turned off the light, and walked out of the room. She went to her own bedroom, got undressed, and slipped on a blue terry cloth robe. Then she went to the living room, picked up a book, sat down on the couch, and started to read. Crystal could hear the rain falling on the roof. She loved that sound. It made her feel relaxed and safe somehow, like the rain would let her hide away from the rest of the world. But after midnight on May 12th, there was a sudden knock at the front door. Crystal put her book down and quickly walked across the living room. She didn't know who was there, but she didn't want their knocking to wake up her daughter. Crystal opened up the door just a little bit, and then she and the person standing outside talked briefly. Then Crystal smiled, opened the door wide, and let the visitor into the house. Just before 1 a.m., so less than an hour after this visitor had knocked on the door and come inside, Sarah woke up in her bed. She heard shouting coming from the kitchen, and so she figured her mom must be in another fight with Dennis. So Sarah closed her eyes and tried to go back to sleep. But then Sarah heard her mom scream, "No!" over and over and over. Sarah got scared and yelled to her mom, but Crystal just kept screaming, "No, no!" from the kitchen. Sarah immediately got out of bed and grabbed her white terry cloth robe that was similar to her mom's, put it on over her pajamas, and crept across her room to the door as quietly as possible. She wanted to help her mom, but she didn't know what to do, so she just crouched there by the door and listened. Then she heard something like boots stomping in the kitchen, and she heard a loud crash like something had fallen onto the floor. Sarah stayed in her room, too terrified to move. Then the house fell silent, and she thought about running out of her room, but suddenly she heard footsteps in the kitchen again, so she kept waiting inside of her bedroom by the door. Minutes later, Sarah heard the sound of the front door opening and shutting, and then there was no more sound coming from the living room or the kitchen. So Sarah stood up, flung her door open, and ran from her bedroom to the front of the house. She looked into the kitchen and she screamed. Sarah saw her mother lying on the kitchen floor. There was blood on her robe and her legs, and near her was the phone that was off the hook. Sarah began yelling for her mother, but Crystal didn't respond. So Sarah grabbed the phone and tried 911, but the phone wasn't working. It just kept on beeping. So Sarah dropped the phone, ran out of the kitchen and out the front door into the rain. She felt wet grass and mud on her bare feet as she turned up the road and ran towards her closest neighbor's house. When she got there, Sarah rushed up to her neighbor's door and started knocking and screaming, but there was no movement inside and nobody answered the door. So Sarah turned and ran to the house across the street. She was cold, her robe was soaked, and her feet were caked in mud. She banged on the door as hard as she could and she waited, but again nobody answered the door. So Sarah turned again up the road and started running into town. By this point, her legs were burning and she was totally out of breath. Sometime after about 1:30 in the morning, after Sarah had run for about 1.5 miles in the rain, she made it into town. She saw a light on inside a small Italian restaurant, so she ran to the restaurant door and started pounding on it. Then she noticed a light go on in the small apartment above the restaurant where the owners lived. And a few seconds later, a man and a woman, the restaurant owners, opened the door. The woman looked totally shocked when she saw Sarah standing there in the rain covered in mud. The woman wrapped her arms around Sarah and brought her into the restaurant. The owners asked what was going on, and Sarah said her mother had just been attacked at their home. The man took Sarah's hand and led her to the phone, while the woman went back upstairs to get Sarah a blanket and dry clothes. The man dialed 911 and told the operator that he needed police assistance immediately and then handed the phone to Sarah. And then Sarah spoke as clearly as she could and told the operator that her mom was at her house and that she was hurt and that there was blood everywhere. A few minutes after the 911 call, Detective Dick Pickett of the Maine State Police drove down a dark, rural stretch of road toward Crystal and Sarah's home. The rain was still falling, and even with the moon shining, visibility wasn't great. But Pickett saw the flashing lights of an ambulance, so he was able to find his way to the small white wooden house nestled in the trees. Pickett parked his car and stepped outside onto the wet, muddy ground. He was about average height, his brown hair was starting to thin, and he wore glasses. He walked into the house and he saw paramedics in the kitchen, but they had already pronounced Crystal Perry, the victim, dead at the scene. So Pickett walked over to Crystal's body. Pickett knew that small Maine towns might not be as picture-perfect as the tourist thought, but he was still shocked at what he saw, and he knew immediately that the news of this crime would cause fear and panic throughout Bridgeton. Pickett couldn't get over the amount of violence that had obviously taken place in this kitchen. His first thought was that this had to have been a crime of passion, carried out by someone who knew Crystal intimately, and whoever had done this had left a huge mess behind. There were bloody boot prints leading from the kitchen to the front door, and there was blood spatter all over the walls and kitchen counters. Soon after Pickett arrived, he was joined by several other state and local police officers and a state forensics team. Pickett led a few of the other officers on a sweep of the house, and they found their way into Sarah's bedroom, where they found the room was totally undisturbed, and there were even a few stuffed animals perfectly placed around the room where Sarah liked to keep them. After the 911 call, an ambulance had been dispatched to the Italian restaurant, and Sarah had been taken to the hospital. Pickett knew he would have to talk to her, but he couldn't imagine what that little girl was feeling at this moment. Pickett and the others checked Crystal's room next, but it also looked like it hadn't been disturbed. So Pickett believed whatever had happened to Crystal only took place in the living room and the kitchen. He walked back towards the kitchen and saw a photographer taking pictures of the scene and forensics officers studying the bloody boot prints on the floors. They hadn't found a murder weapon yet, but they still had plenty of evidence to work with, and Pickett saw a forensics officer crouched over Crystal's body, and she was fixated on one of Crystal's legs. She called Pickett and other forensics officers over, and she pointed to a small drop of blood on Crystal's leg that was almost a perfect circle. Pickett asked why that particular drop of blood was any different than the rest of the blood on Crystal's legs. The forensics officer looked up at him, pointed at the drop of blood again, and said they needed to take a sample of it, because she knew a drop like that had to be what was known as a passive blood drop. That meant it did not come from Crystal. And in this particular case, the forensics officer said the blood could have only dripped off of someone who was standing right over Crystal and fallen onto her body after she was already dead. So the forensics officer was pretty confident that that drop of blood belonged to Crystal's killer. The forensics team took the blood sample and gathered other blood samples from around the room. But Pickett knew testing them would take time, and having DNA from a blood sample didn't mean authorities would necessarily be able to match it to anyone. So Pickett called his investigative team together. He said he knew it was late, but he wanted to work fast and he wanted to work smart. He sent members of the team out in the middle of the night to see if they could track down and interview Crystal's neighbors, friends, and family. And within a couple of hours, Pickett got news that set the investigation in motion. One of Crystal's friends had told police that 2 weeks earlier, Crystal's fiancé, Dennis, had shown up to Crystal's house waving a knife around and threatening to kill her. At 4 a.m., 2.5 hours after police arrived at Crystal's house, Detective Pickett and 3 other officers knocked on the door of Dennis's parents' house where Dennis was staying. It took a few minutes, but Dennis finally answered and let the police inside. Pickett asked Dennis if he had seen Crystal that night, and then Dennis did something that kind of stunned all of the officers. Instead of answering the question, Dennis started pacing the room, and he turned to the cops and asked, "Is Crystal dead?" And as soon as that happened, the police decided they really needed to bring Dennis in right away for questioning. A little later that morning, Dennis sat across from Pickett and the other members of the investigative team in a small, cramped police interrogation room. Pickett didn't waste any time with pleasantries. He told Dennis that in the few hours since they had found Crystal's body, they had already learned that she and Dennis had a pretty rough relationship and that Dennis was known to have a temper and to get aggressive. Dennis admitted that things were bad between him and Crystal, but that didn't mean he was a killer. He said a lot of couples yell and scream at each other when they argue. Then, in a calm voice, Pickett asked if Dennis was at all responsible for Crystal's death, and Dennis said no. But then, Dennis started shaking, almost like he was having convulsions. Every cop in the room had seen suspects get nervous and have trouble staying still during interrogations, but none of them had seen anything like this before. They got Dennis calmed down and made sure he was physically okay. Then they asked him if he'd be willing to submit samples for DNA testing. Then Dennis steadied himself and said he would. After hours with the police, Dennis left the station, and Pickett thought there was a good chance that once the test results came in, Dennis's DNA would match the DNA from the drop of blood the forensics team had taken from Crystal's leg and from other similar drops they had found in the kitchen. So Pickett thought there was a pretty good chance he'd be able to close this case quickly. On the afternoon of May 12th, so a few hours after police had questioned Dennis, Detective Pickett and another officer walked into a small bedroom inside of Sarah's grandmother's house, so Crystal's mother's house. There, they saw Crystal's 12-year-old daughter, Sarah, sitting almost motionless on the bed, staring at the sunlight that was coming in through the window. After Sarah had been released from the hospital, she had been sent to stay with her grandmother. Pickett approached Sarah and introduced himself. Then, Pickett very calmly and gently asked Sarah to please tell them what had happened at her house the night before. Sarah took a deep breath and then told the officers that she had been asleep and then heard her mom screaming in the other room. She said she had stayed in her own room until everything went quiet. Then she told the officers about how she found her mom in the kitchen, how she tried to call the police, and then how she ended up running outside and all the way into town to get help. Pickett smiled at Sarah and then asked her if she had maybe caught a glimpse of the person who was with her mother, or if maybe she had recognized this person's voice. Sarah stared at Pickett. She didn't like how he was talking to her, like she was just a little kid. Sarah said she didn't see the other person because she stayed in her room the whole time, and all she had heard was shouting, so she couldn't make out the other person's voice. Pickett smiled again, then he asked her if she liked her mother's boyfriend, Dennis. And was it maybe possible that Sarah knew Dennis had been in their house, but she just didn't want to say that because she wanted to protect him? Sarah glared at Pickett. She was young, but she was smart and observant, and she thought the police wanted her to be an eyewitness who had seen the man who they already believed had killed her mom. But Sarah said she really didn't know who else had been in the house. Pickett thanked Sarah for talking to them, and he and the other officer walked out of the room and headed outside. Pickett did believe Dennis was the most likely culprit, but police would have to wait weeks on DNA test results, and Pickett had no intention of excluding any other leads that might come up between now and those results coming in. Later that day, the investigative team met with more of Crystal's friends and coworkers, and most of them pointed the finger at Dennis too. They knew about his and Crystal's history, and they knew about Dennis's temper. But a few of her friends said there was another man police should look into, Crystal's ex-husband and Sarah's father, Tom Perry. So Pickett began digging into Tom's background right away. He discovered that Crystal had been after Tom to pay the monthly child support that he owed her because he was not giving her the money that the court had ordered him to pay after he and Crystal got divorced. Pickett figured if Crystal had been after Tom for money, that might have been a motive for Tom to attack her. But as Pickett learned about Tom, he started to think there might actually be an even more likely suspect than him. Because Pickett found out that Crystal had once filed a restraining order against one of Tom's girlfriends, Joanne Stager. And after speaking to one of Crystal's friends, Pickett learned that in the past few weeks, Joanne had been harassing Crystal. And it turned out that those angry, disturbing phone calls Crystal had been getting at the house were not coming from Dennis like Sarah thought. They had been coming from Joanne, and she had been threatening Crystal. 2 days after Crystal's murder, Detective Pickett and members of his team sat in the living room across from Crystal's ex-husband Tom and his girlfriend Joanne at the house the couple shared. The investigative team still considered Crystal's boyfriend Dennis their primary suspect, but with new information about Tom, and especially about his girlfriend Joanne, they had another promising lead. Pickett looked at the couple sitting on the couch. They were both in their 30s, and they were both tall and had dark hair, and Joanne couldn't seem to stay still for more than a few seconds at a time. Pickett asked Tom about his relationship with Crystal, and when he did, Pickett immediately saw a look of anger come across Joanne's face. But Tom would answer, and he would say that he barely ever talked to Crystal anymore, and he said he totally regretted this, but he didn't really play any meaningful role in his daughter, Sarah's, life. After that, Pickett turned to Joanne and asked her about the restraining order Crystal had filed against her. Joanne kind of laughed, and then she told Pickett a story like she was performing on a stage. She said a couple years earlier she had seen Crystal's red hair from across the dance floor at a club, and she had seen men watching Crystal from all over the place like they always did. But she wasn't angry about that. She was angry because she believed Crystal still had a thing for Tom, and she was tired of Crystal calling the house. So she had marched across the dance floor and confronted Crystal about it. She said Crystal had gotten angry and looked like she was about to start a fight, and so preemptively, Joanne punched her in the face. As Pickett listened to this story, he had trouble believing that anybody other than Joanne had been the cause of that fight. After she was done, Pickett asked her about the angry phone calls, and Joanne said she was just telling Crystal to back off and to leave Tom alone. But Joanne said she would never kill anyone. Finally, Pickett asked where each of them had been at the time of Crystal's murder, and they said they had been together at the house. Pickett knew they could be telling the truth, but each of them being the other's alibi wasn't nearly enough for Pickett to accept their story, so he asked if they would submit DNA samples for testing. Tom and Joanne looked at each other, and then they both looked back at Pickett and said they would be willing to do that. Later that day, Pickett returned to the station. As he looked over his notes from the interviews police had already conducted, he still thought Dennis made the most sense as the suspect. But after meeting with Tom and Joanne, he definitely thought there were other viable suspects. Then, on May 15th, 3 days after Crystal's murder, her friends and family held a small funeral service at a church before Crystal was to be cremated. Sarah stood in the church quietly, and she listened to friends and family talk about her mother and about how much her mom had loved her. And then at some point, Sarah's mother's siblings got up and they said they would get justice for Crystal, whatever it took. And then after the funeral, members of the investigative team heard from one of Crystal's friends that Joanne had been seen popping open champagne and toasting to Crystal's death. And after that, at least some members of the state police started to believe Joanne was just as likely to have killed Crystal as Dennis. In early summer of 1994, weeks after Crystal's murder, results from DNA testing conducted during the investigation started to trickle in, and those results left Detective Pickett and the investigative team in complete shock. The DNA sample from the drop of blood taken from Crystal's leg and other samples taken from her body and around the crime scene did not match the DNA samples provided by Dennis, Tom, or Joanne. Investigators had become so convinced that one of those three people had killed Crystal that they had trouble accepting these DNA results. So they asked for the lab to run the tests again. But when they did, the results were the same. There was no match to any of the main suspects in the case. After that, the authorities ran the DNA test results through something called CODIS, which is a massive FBI database with DNA results from convicted offenders of violent crimes from across the country. And in 1994, the FBI had just started using CODIS to assist police investigations nationwide. So Pickett had high hopes that this new technology would help keep his investigation on track. But the DNA samples taken from Crystal and her house did not match anyone in this massive FBI database. So all of a sudden, this case that had three strong suspects who all had clear motives completely fell apart, and Pickett and his team found themselves having to start all over. But after reassessing the crime scene and conducting a new round of interviews, all of the investigators' theories just felt like pure conjecture. Police followed leads that could possibly connect Crystal's murder to a serial killer who had been caught in the region, but DNA evidence also quickly ruled that out as well. Then, investigators started to look at the possibility that Crystal's murder could have been a robbery gone wrong. Maybe some drug user had broken into her house to steal valuables to sell for drug money, and then of course something had gone wrong and Crystal had wound up dead. After all, drugs were a real issue in Bridgeton, Maine. But a drug addict breaking in, or any robber for that matter, didn't really make sense to Pickett. He and members of the forensics team had always believed the level of violence that had taken place in Crystal's murder indicated it must have been a crime of passion, not some random robbery that just got interrupted. So Pickett soon came to terms with the fact that his investigation had almost nothing to go on. And by the summer of 1995, a year after Crystal's murder, her case was just not a top priority anymore, and it started to go cold. And in May of 1996, 2 years after Crystal's murder, there was still no new information coming in. Crystal's siblings posted a $10,000 reward for anyone who could provide information that would lead to the arrest of the person who had killed their sister, but none of the people who then came forward were able to provide any useful evidence. So another year went by with almost nothing new on the case. Then, not long after that, Detective Pickett retired from the Maine State Police, and people in Bridgeton figured they would never know who had killed Crystal. By that time, Sarah had moved to Texas to live with family members there, and she was doing her best to try to live her life. She thought about her mother constantly, but she had started to distance herself from her friends and family in Maine, as well as the police she had met during the investigation. Years went by without Sarah ever hearing anything new about her mother's murder case, and she grew up, graduated high school, went to college, and then got a job. The little 12-year-old girl who had found her mother murdered in the kitchen and who had run across town in the rain in the middle of the night to get help had now become an adult. And like almost everybody else, Sarah had eventually given up on ever knowing who had killed her mom. In April of 2006, almost 12 years after Crystal's murder, Detective Walter Gerzib of the Maine State Police was sitting in his office. Gerzib had been involved in the investigation into Crystal's murder when he was a young officer, and after Pickett retired, Gerzib had moved up the ranks, and he had remained one of the few investigators who continued to try to find new leads in Crystal's murder case. But that case had remained cold for over a decade, so Gerzib was not hopeful that he or anyone else would ever solve it. Gerzib's phone rang at his desk, so he answered it, and an FBI agent introduced themselves on the other line. And after the two had talked for a few minutes, Gerzib couldn't believe what he was hearing. The FBI agent told him a kidnapper had been caught and convicted in Maine. That kidnapper had submitted a DNA sample, and that sample had been run through the FBI database, and it had matched the blood samples that had been found on Crystal and in her house 12 years earlier. Gerzib hung up the phone in total shock. Soon after the call, Gerzib, other members of the Maine State Police, and FBI agents met with this kidnapper who was in custody. And after that meeting, Gerzib would make a phone call he had been waiting to make for years. He would call Crystal's daughter, Sarah, who was 24 years old at the time, and he would tell her that the police finally knew who had killed her mother. Based on the meeting with the convicted kidnapper, interviews conducted during the investigation, and evidence and DNA samples collected from the crime scene, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened the night somebody murdered Crystal Perry on May 12, 1994. A little before 1 a.m., the killer listened to the sound of their windshield wipers going back and forth while they drove in the rain down a tree-lined road towards Crystal's house. The killer felt their hands tingling. They figured that feeling was the feeling of anticipation because they'd finally gotten up the guts to do something they had wanted to do for a long time. The killer pulled off the road into Crystal's driveway and parked their car behind hers. They turned off the engine, took the keys out of the ignition, and then sat there just listening to the rain and staring at the house for a couple of minutes. Then the killer got out of the car, walked up the driveway, and knocked on the front door. Crystal opened the door just enough to see who was there, and then moments later, she smiled and let the killer in. The killer walked into the house and made their way towards the kitchen, with Crystal following a couple of feet behind. Once the killer reached the kitchen, they stopped, turned around, and looked Crystal in the eye. The killer took a breath and then walked right up to Crystal and put their arms on her arms and then moved in to give her a kiss. But Crystal immediately pushed the killer off and told them to get out of the house. Without thinking, the killer lunged at Crystal, grabbed her, and pulled her onto the ground. Crystal kicked and thrashed, but she could not get free. And so with Crystal pinned down, the killer began to sexually assault her. After it was over, the killer got up off the floor and quickly walked over to a drawer, opened it up, and pulled out a sharp kitchen knife. Crystal saw it and screamed "no" over and over and over again, pulling herself up off the floor and running for the phone. Crystal managed to grab it, but the killer had wheeled around by this point and wrapped their arms around her, and the phone fell to the floor. The killer then threw Crystal back on the floor and pinned her to the ground again. Then the killer raised the knife, and immediately Crystal threw her fists and kicked wildly at the killer, and the killer suddenly felt the knife slice into their own hand, and they saw blood dripping from it. But the killer kept Crystal pinned to the ground, they raised the knife and slammed it into her chest. After that, Crystal stopped fighting, and her body went limp. But the killer just kept on raising that knife and dropping it over and over and over again. In total, the killer would stab Crystal over 50 times. Finally, the killer stopped stabbing and looked around the room. There was blood everywhere, and their boots had left bloody prints on the floor. And the blood from the cut on the killer's hand kept dripping on Crystal's leg. The killer stood up, pocketed the knife, and walked over to the kitchen counter. They grabbed paper towels, knelt down, and started wiping away some of the blood on the floor. But there was just too much, and they had already been in the house for so long, so the killer just held on to the bloody paper towels. They walked back through the house, went outside, and got into their car. They threw the car in reverse, pulled out onto the road, and drove not far down the road to where they lived in town. Michael Hutchinson, the young man with the drug problem who walked around town all the time high on cocaine, who had gone to high school with Dennis, had murdered Crystal. Michael had never even come up in the investigation because there was really no connection between him and Crystal. It turned out that when Michael came to Crystal's house on the night of the murder, police believe he asked to use her phone because he said he was having car trouble. And Crystal most likely let Michael in because she recognized him as a local and because she was just a nice person. But some members of the police believe Michael was a bit more calculated, that he had probably been one of those men who checked out Crystal from a distance when she was in town or at a bar or on a dance floor, and Michael had wanted her. And so he had shown up to her house, possibly under the influence of alcohol and drugs, and tried to get her to sleep with him. And when Crystal rejected him, Michael went into a blind rage, and he sexually assaulted her and ultimately killed her. And Michael had basically gotten away with it and never even been suspected for years. But then Michael got busted for something totally separate, kidnapping, and he submitted DNA samples, and the FBI database got a hit. Michael's new DNA samples matched the passive blood drops taken from Crystal's leg and from her house. Further tests also showed that Michael's semen matched the semen samples taken from Crystal's body. And finally, when investigators met with Michael, they saw a large scar on his hand from a cut that matched the type of knife that was used to kill Crystal. Michael was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. As of 2023, Sarah, Crystal's daughter, is a very successful author. She wrote a memoir about her life with her mother before the murder and her life after the murder. The book's dedication page simply reads, "For her."
They see the cracks, they find the flaws. They don't believe in your just cause. I spend my time just running low, hiding seeds that wouldn't grow. Deep inside, a fire caught, a lesson that can't be bought. You gotta build a base that's wider than the fear they try to sell. I put my anchor down and stop the sway.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called Mr. Ballin, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one.